Hello and welcome to the Indie Beginning Podcast, episode 17, Goldilocks and the Three World Builders. Many people believe that authors place too much focus on world building, while others think that they leave too much to the imagination. Is there a just right amount of world building? Last week we introduced readers to Paul Grover's science fiction novel Ark of Souls, with our first ever enhanced audio version of the reading. Do you want to hear more enhanced audio versions? Please let us know by sending us an email or commenting on one of our social media pages, all of which may be found at acmbooks.com/indie-beginning. This week's episode is brought to you by your local library. Stop checking for likes on Facebook and get into a real book today. On today's episode, Marie and I discuss reviews left for Ark of Souls, as well as if there is even a rule for world building. I also have a conversation with Paul Grover on this topic.
So before we get into this discussion, we should probably let the listeners know that we're on vacation. So any odd noises, we're in a house with 3 other families right now. But last week we introduced the listeners to Ark of Souls, by the sci-fi novel by Paul Grover. What did you think about the story?
I absolutely loved this story. I loved the action in it. Everything about it makes it feel like a video game.
I thought like the first chapter created enough suspense to just make you want to read more. And honestly, I did. I know the rule is for me, I'm only supposed to read the first chapter before the discussion, but I kept going.
Yeah, I broke that too. I finished the entire book.
Yeah, I feel like it's gonna end up being kind of like a Lost Fleet type thing by Jack Campbell. And I really enjoyed that series. Obviously, there's definitely differences in this one. How did our reviewers on Amazon and Goodreads find it?
Well, everybody loves Mira. Carmela says, "How can I love this book so much when I don't like sci-fi? I fell in love with the main female character, Mira Thorne. She's my kind of woman, strong yet deeply flawed, lesbian, and is driven by an unwavering moral compass."
Yeah, and Marie said, "I love the way Mira, our heroine, is portrayed. Very flawed, very human. I could picture every aspect of her, and the author doesn't miss a detail in her story."
One Amazon customer said, "I feel I could wax lyrical about Ark of Souls for paragraphs. Instead, I will sum up by saying, this book had me gripped and caring from the first word to the last. And from a first-time author who is self-published from start to finish, I would have never known had I not been informed from elsewhere. Can't wait for book 2. Get a move on, Paul."
Get a move on, Paul. Well, this week's topic discussion is Goldilocks and the Three World Builders. World building is a big topic for science fiction and fantasy, but it's also controversial. Some people think you build too much. Some people think you don't do enough. It's just like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. In Lincoln Michel's post against world building, he states, "World building is the similarian. World conjuring is ancient myths and fairy tales. In fairy tales, we don't learn the construction techniques of the witch's gingerbread house or the import-export routes of the evil dwarves." I sometimes agree with this. I've put books down before because the author went too far into detail. How about you?
I tend not to. I don't want to know too much. You don't need to tell me every leaf's shape, color, size, what it smells like, looks like. So I agree with that.
And I'll be honest, there are some books that absolutely need it. Books like Hyperion by Dan Simmons. There's like a whole arc on religion, but that was necessary because the religion evolved from this one specific thing that happened in the book. I don't want to ruin it for readers, but you had to get into it for it to make sense. Mm-hmm. But like I said, I have put books down before. From a December 17 article in The Independent, it was reported that a good book can keep your concentration for 15 minutes. And in my view, after 15 minutes, the mind starts to wander. You know, if we spend 15 minutes on unnecessary information that a reader could have filled in for themselves, we've lost their attention if they drifted away. Now, you do that 2 or 3 times in the first 20 pages, first 30 pages, you've lost a reader for your entire career.
And I do that a lot in my own book. I give you the outline of how it should look. If it has 2 suns, 3 suns, 4 moons, but then I literally tell you I'm not going to go into every little detail because you've already imagined it in your mind.
Yep. And Stephen King he brings that up in On Writing. He's like, they already know what car they're going to think about in their head. Mm-hmm. So just say car. But Lincoln Michel brings up in that same article against world building that a prime example would be A Song of Fire and Ice, because the different religions, political factions, regional customs, they're a huge appeal. And he also says, like, the longer we stay in a world, the more world building is necessary. But for, like, Paul Grover's story, he's in a unique situation, especially, and not just Paul Grover, but all sci-fi. I know in the second chapter, he mentions, like, a far-off world or a place. He doesn't know if in 5 books he's going to have to end up back in that place. So he needs to world build for something that he may never come back to.
Right.
So, speaking of Paul Grover, let's listen to the interview I did with him about world building.
As an author of science fiction, world building plays an important part in your story. Everything from spaceships, future mechanics, to even planets and their ecosystems must be dreamed up by you. So here's a chicken or the egg question. Which came first? Do you have a story in mind and then world build around it, or vice versa? Or does each one mold the other?
For me, they tend to work hand in hand. I've usually got an idea of what my world's going to be like in advance, so I'll work out roughly what the aesthetic of the world is, the nature of the universe. Is it a utopian society or a dystopian one? Does everything work, or is everything a little bit run down? I'll have an idea of the system of governance and how society is organised. But aside from that, I'll kind of conjure each scene as I go along. So I'll identify what a scene needs, what it needs to get from point A to point B, and what features of the world I want to draw on and illustrate within the scene. Once I've done that, I will generally make a note of what I've produced and how I've produced it. So if I ever return back to it at a later date, I've got that data to call on.
What major writing dilemmas or roadblocks have you come across during your world building process? How did you overcome this struggle?
Yeah, I think when you build complicated worlds, you inevitably build traps for yourself. It's an occupational hazard of world building. I think good planning can actually alleviate some of that, and some advanced building can help with that. But it's often the small details that catch you out. So, for example, you have a planetary system, you work out what colour the star is, you work out how many planets there are, you work out the name of the habitable one and what the habitable one's climate's like. You work out where resources come from and what jobs people do, and you have your characters arrive there. They jump off their starship and they go and buy coffee, and they can't buy their coffee because you haven't actually worked out how the galactic economy works. Does the money they have in their pockets, is it universal, or do they have to change to a local currency? Is money even a feature of your universe? So it's little things like that you have to consider. And I know it's a slightly contrived example, but certainly the type of thing I would fall victim of in Ark of Souls was communication distances and inconsistencies creeping in due to time lag between sending a message and a message arriving. So quite often I'd send a message from Earth, and even with faster than light communications, it would take 2 weeks to arrive at the frontier. In the time it's been travelling, the person it's meant for has already set off on the mission that they're being asked to do. So, what I'll do at first draft stage is go back and reassess all of those problems and take them out if necessary.
I'm glad that you brought up traps. Throughout the internet, there are lists of the deadly sins of science fiction world building. That include themes like basing a distant planet too much on Earth or creating beings that are too human-like. Have you ever found yourself falling into one of these world building traps?
I've read many of these lists over the years, and I've lost a lot of sleep over them. But I've kind of come to the conclusion now that they really are just guidelines. They're not rules, they're not set in stone. And the reason being, if your story is strong enough and you can come up with a credible explanation for something, there's no reason why you shouldn't ignore those rules, tear them up and shred them if you need to. To give you a couple of examples of that, I'd like to talk about the idea of Earth-like planets and human-like aliens. In Ark of Souls, we have many Earth-like planets. The reason being that I think if humans were to make it into space, they're going to seek out worlds that are similar to our own, simply because they make for the most comfortable living environment. A planet with similar gravity and similar atmosphere is going to be much more enjoyable to live on than, say, the planet from Alien, which seems quite unpleasant, to be fair. So I think humans are going to naturally seek out the best option for them, and why would they bother terraforming rocky worlds if they could live on a sort of a tropical paradise? So that takes me into the idea of alien species and what they're going to be like, and why would they necessarily be like us? One we've evolved in such a way that we can exploit the Earth's environment to our maximum advantage. So, walking upright and having binocular vision has allowed us to basically carry a bigger brain around, get more input, and kind of influence the world around us. Having opposable thumbs and the brain power to work out what to do with them allows us to use tools, drive cars, and play Call of Duty. So we are perfectly well adapted for where we live. Now, an assumption that I'm making in a lot of the Ark of Souls universe is that aliens growing up under similar conditions, they may have evolved from reptiles or even insects or another kind of base species. But under similar conditions, it seems kind of logical that they may walk on their hind legs, they may have opposable thumbs, they may have 2 arms and 2 eyes, just like we do. Where they would differ is in their mindset and their outlook on the world. Who's to say they would have the same ethics, the same morals, or the same societal structure of us? I think if you map those kind of things onto an alien species, then you're getting into trouble. But I think you can still have a relatable kind of humanoid alien who displays an entirely different value set. And I think that kind of adds a little bit of conflict into the story as well, because you've kind of, well, they look like us, but they don't think like us. So I think that's kind of an interesting way to pursue that. But I think overall, you have to kind of make your choices and you have to kind of justify them. If your story can carry it, don't worry about breaking anyone's rules.
In his post titled Against World Building on the Electric Literature website, Lincoln Michel discusses world building versus world conjuring. His distinction is that world building attempts to create every little detail from the exact moment people wake up to currency exchange rates and so on, while, and I quote, world conjuring does not attempt to construct a scale model in the reader's bedroom. World conjuring uses hints and literary magic to create the illusion of a world, with the reader working to fill in the gaps. World building imposes, world conjuring collaborates. What are your thoughts on this?
I definitely do both, and I like the idea of having a sort of a firm, solid touchstone in which to go to refer to for broad brush elements of the world. But I kind of also like the idea of discovering the world as the characters do. I think that's important as a writer because it makes it very interesting to actually write a scene and build the world as you go through it, because you're making the discoveries at the same time as the character. So sometimes, you can impart your sense of wonder into them, and it kind of makes it much more immediate. And I also think readers respond to that as well, because they're discovering the world at the same time as your characters are as well. So it's like they're looking over their shoulder. I think it's important once you've done that, though, to kind of keep everything documented. So once you've created a scene, to sort of sit back, look through it and actually see what you've put in it, to make sure it's consistent with your overview of the world, to make sure it's consistent with your previous scenes, and to make sure that you can use it again at a later date. So I've got a database on my system I constantly am updating with new facts about the world, little features about different locations and that type of thing. So I think conjuring's great, and I kind of think of it a little bit like building a film set. So we've got a scene that we need our characters to move through, so we build a set for them to interact with. They interact with it and they move on to the next scene, so we build the set for that as we go. What we're hoping is that the reader, and to some extent maybe the characters, don't take a little peek behind the back and see all the scaffolding that's holding it together.
So Paul, if you found yourself miraculously transported back through time and were sitting with your early writing self, what is the one piece of writing wisdom that you would impart?
If I could go back in time and have a word with myself, I think the thing I would probably be most keen to impress upon my early writing self would be not to work in secret. I probably spent a good 18 months of development on Ark of Souls, sitting up late at night, typing away, and no one had a clue what I was doing. I think my wife found out after about 2 years that I didn't actually have a sleep disorder. I was actually writing a book. And the problem I had then, there was times you just feel so isolated and cut off. And actually when you open up and you show people what you're doing, you start getting some feedback. You get a feel for what's right and what's not so right. And you start to feel your confidence grow. And then subsequently, having published Ark of Souls, I've discovered the wonderful thing that is the indie community. Other writers have been so supportive, so helpful, so giving of advice, and so inspirational. And it's great to get out and meet those people. I so wish I'd done that sooner, because at times I'll be sitting at the keyboard, banging my head on the desk thinking, this doesn't work, I'm going to give it all up and go and live in Tibet as a goat. And you can just jump onto social media and just fire off a post, and someone will come back and say, try doing this. And you're like, that worked. And so being able to do that is fantastic. So I tell myself not to lock myself in a room, treat writing as a social thing, not an isolating thing. There's one other bit of advice I would give myself, and that would be drink more coffee and get a really good coffee machine, because as a writer, you're actually going to need it.
I think he's absolutely right when he brings up like the planet from Aliens. We're going to seek out planets that we're familiar with, because that's what we need to survive.
Yeah, and it's easy to visualize.
Yeah, easy to visualize, but just the reality of the situation. If we actually explore worlds, when we look for Earth-like planets, that's what we're looking for. Earth-like planets. That's why it's what scientists say. It's
Earth-like. Yep.
As an author, what did you think about how he answered the last question about his always making sure people know what you're doing, not trying to hide your writing from people because of their feedback and stuff?
No, I can agree with that. I mean, something that I write, I want to show you, or I want to show somebody else, because their perspective on it could either tell you whether it would work or not work. And remember, like in a series, you could possibly go back to that world, and why make it either too complicated or not explained enough that nobody but you knows what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And for more information on that, we did do an editing episode. You could just look back in our past episodes. So what's your feel on world building, Marie?
I love building worlds. It's kind of a way that you can throw science out the window and anything goes. Absolutely anything. So like even taking the smallest thing, there was a bouncy ball that one of our kids had, and I made an entire world based off that bouncy ball.
Yeah, and I get that, we live in a time of science and everything has to be science-backed, but I think it's nice to just throw science to the wind sometimes. And I'm not saying that Paul does that. I'm not at all. I'm arguing for the people that do that. Magic and stuff. But even some magic gets based on real science.
Well, and I don't want people to think that just because they don't know all the facts or how gravity works or this or that they shouldn't write, because they just don't know it.
If you have an idea in mind, it doesn't have to, I know when I read a book, I'm not going in it with a notepad just to destroy the author. And I feel like some people absolutely, that's what they want to do. Oh, you're Mr. Right, Mr. Wrong. We went to social media for opinions on world building. There were many comments on authors creating too much or too little, but one memorable conversation happened with Sarah Katz and myself in the writers group on Facebook. She said, "While not sure if it's a dilemma, a challenge I often tackle is making sure to construct my created world without any glaring direct parallels from ours, usually at risk to arise from socioeconomic structures and racial dichotomies within communities. I personally tend to design all the way down to clothing style, language, and type of food. Takes a while, but sure is worth it." She continued to say, "It certainly boils down to the genre of writing in many aspects." And as it sounds like the family just returned from the store, I think that would be a good spot to leave it on today.
I think so, at least until we can get them out to the beach and sunburnt and passed out.
Ark of Souls is available for purchase on Amazon. Hurry up and grab your copy before the sequel is released. We would love to thank our niece Madison for letting everyone know that she had arrived, and you, the listener, for understanding. I think it added a little something. And if you, the listener, would like to join in on these episodes, send Indie Beginning an audio review of each week's featured story. Simply record your thoughts into your phone recorder and send it along to reviews.indiebeginning@gmail.com, or write a review on our ACM Books website. Become part of our featured authors' stories by helping them learn and grow. Music found in this week's episode was written and performed by Swelling and comes from the album Projector Music for Visual Media. Please take a moment to rate and review our show on your favorite podcast platform. Reviews are such an important part of the growth of any project. If you are an author and would like to hear your work featured on a future episode, go to acmbooks.com/submit. I am your host, Benjamin Frankie, asking everyone to read more books, be the best possible you, and to simply enjoy this wonderful life. Thanks for listening.